The polished oak of the front door felt unnaturally cold beneath Sophie's trembling hand. It was a solid, imposing barrier, a final checkpoint between the suffocating, silent judgment of her mother's house and the crisp, cleansing autumn air she craved like a lungful of life itself. Against her leg, her 6-year-old son, Daniel, was a small, warm anchor in the turbulent sea of her emotions. His hand, sticky from a biscuit he'd eaten earlier, was clutching a worn, one-eyed teddy bear named Barnaby, a cherished friend she had painstakingly mended for him just last week. He was humming a cheerful, rambling song, a private little tune that was entirely his own, blissfully unaware of the emotional storm that had just raged and broken within the pristine, museum-like walls of the house. Agnes stood in the grand hallway, her posture as rigid and unyielding as the severe, antique furniture that flanked her like sentinels. Her face, a carefully composed mask of cool disapproval, was a stark contrast to the doting, effusive grandmother she performed for friends and neighbors. The air was still thick and heavy, crackling with the phantom energy of the words that had been exchanged. Or rather, the monologue that had been delivered. It wasn't a fight. It was a verdict. "I simply don't understand your stubbornness, Sophie," Agnes had begun, her voice a low, cultured murmur that somehow carried more sting than a shout. She had gestured with a perfectly manicured hand towards the far corner of the living room, a space that looked more like a toy emporium than a family space. A gleaming red bicycle, a multi-level race car track, a robotics kit still in its cellophane wrapper, a mountain of expensive, barely touched offerings. "I provide these things because I can. Because he deserves them. He's a child. He needs stability, opportunity. He needs more." Sophie's own voice had been a quiet counterpoint to the resonant condemnation. "He has what he needs, Mother." She had tried, as she always did, to bridge the vast, uncomprehending gulf between them. "He has a home. He has food on the table. He knows he is loved." "Love doesn't pay for new shoes when those are worn through," Agnes had countered, her sharp eyes flicking down to Daniel's scuffed sneakers. "Love doesn't pay for the tutors he will need to get into a good school. You are so focused on the poetry of it all. You refuse to see the prose. You work 2 jobs, you're exhausted, and your pride is preventing him from having the childhood he could have." The accusation of pride was the knife twist. It wasn't pride, it was survival. It was the fierce, desperate need to be the sole provider of her son's world, to prove that she was enough. Now, as Sophie finally summoned the strength to turn the heavy brass doorknob, ready to make her escape, Agnes delivered the final, cutting blow. Her voice was not loud, but it sliced through the silence with the chilling precision of a scalpel. "You're wrong, you know," she stated, not with anger, but with a cold, unshakable certainty. Her eyes, the same shade of blue as Sophie's but hardened by disappointment, met hers in the gilded hall mirror. Kids don't remember who loves them. They only remember who is there, day after day, with a full wallet. The words struck Sophie with the force of a physical slap, knocking the air from her lungs. They were designed to crumble her resolve, to plant a seed of poisonous doubt that would fester long after she had driven away. She felt the familiar, hot sting of tears behind her eyes, but refused to let them fall. She would not give her mother the satisfaction. Instead, she squeezed Daniel's hand, drawing strength from his small, solid presence. She looked down at his bright, curious face, now turned up to hers, and a wave of fierce, protective love washed over her, a tidal wave that extinguished the burning fires of her anger and humiliation. "Ready to go on an adventure, sweetie?" she asked, her voice miraculously steady, even cheerful. Daniel nodded, his smile a beacon of pure, uncomplicated joy. "Can we finish my space adventure book tonight, Mommy? The one where the spaceship goes into the swirly-whirly galaxy? The Spiral Nebula?" Sophie smiled, her heart aching with a mix of profound pain and overwhelming love. "Of course we can, and I'll do all the funny robot voices." That was her currency. Not money, not extravagant toys, but shared stories before bedtime, mended teddy bears, and the quiet, unbreakable promise of being there, no matter how tired she was, no matter how much the world told her she wasn't enough. As they stepped out into the fading afternoon light, the door clicking shut behind them with an air of finality, Sophie didn't look back. She didn't see the flicker of something unreadable. Was it regret? Triumph? In Agnes's eyes before the heavy oak sealed them out. All she could feel was the chilling weight of her mother's words. A gauntlet thrown down. A challenge she was now more determined than ever to meet. Agnes believed love could be measured in price tags and grand gestures. Sophie knew it was measured in quiet moments, in shared laughter, in sacrifices made in the dark when no one was watching. And as they walked towards their beat-up but reliable car, Sophie held on to a secret. It was a project she had been pouring her heart and soul into for months, working at the small kitchen table long after Daniel had fallen asleep. It was her answer to Agnes's cruel philosophy, a testament to a love that could never be bought, and a gift for Daniel that she prayed would prove her mother wrong. The drive home was a descent into a world of deepening twilight and quiet contemplation. The fiery oranges and purples of the sunset painted the sky, a dramatic, beautiful spectacle that Sophie's tired mind registered only in fleeting glimpses. Daniel, buckled securely in his car seat, chattered on, a constant, bubbling stream of consciousness that kept the silence at bay. He recounted the plot of a cartoon he'd watched that morning, described in intricate detail the way a spider had built a web on their balcony, and asked a series of unanswerable questions about why squirrels flicked their tails. Sophie answered him with a gentle patience she didn't feel, her mind a tangled knot of resentment and anxiety. Agnes's words echoed in the enclosed space of the car, each syllable a fresh sting. Kids don't remember who loves them. They only remember who is there, with a full wallet. The assertion was so cynical, so dismissive of everything Sophie was striving to be. Was she truly just a proud fool, sacrificing her son's comfort for a principle he couldn't possibly understand? She glanced in the rearview mirror at his small, animated face, and the doubt pricked at her. He was happy, yes, but he was also a child. He saw the gleaming toys at his grandmother's house. He saw the advertisements on television. How long would her stories and mended bears be enough? Their apartment building was modest, a 3-story walk-up with clean but worn hallways. Yet, the moment Sophie unlocked the door to their own small space, the tension in her shoulders eased. Here, she could finally breathe. It was a world away from the cold, curated perfection of her mother's home. Their apartment was small, and the furniture was a collection of second-hand pieces she had lovingly refinished herself. But it was a space that pulsed with life and warmth. Daniel's colorful, imaginative drawings were held to the refrigerator by a jumble of mismatched magnets. A lopsided clay pot he had made in a school art class sat on the windowsill, proudly holding a resilient succulent. The air smelled of cinnamon from the oatmeal they'd had for breakfast and the faint, clean scent of laundry soap. It was the scent of home. They ate a simple dinner of grilled cheese sandwiches and tomato soup at the small kitchen table. Daniel dunked his sandwich with gusto, getting soup on his chin and retelling a joke he'd heard from a friend at school. Sophie found herself genuinely laughing, the knot in her chest loosening with each shared smile. This was real. This was their stability. It wasn't an allowance or a trust fund. It was the easy, unforced rhythm of their life together. Later, tucked into Daniel's bed, the promise was fulfilled. The bed itself was a testament to their shared world, with a comforter patterned with planets and glow-in-the-dark stars stuck to the ceiling above. Sophie opened the space adventure book, its cover soft with wear. "Okay," she began, her voice dropping into a dramatic whisper. Captain Danny and his trusty first mate, Commander Barnaby, had just escaped the clutches of the meteor monsters of Malachor. But now their spaceship, the Stardust, was drifting towards the great swirly-whirly galaxy. Daniel giggled, pulling the covers up to his nose. "Do the robot voice for the ship's computer," Sophie complied, producing a series of monotone beeps and boops before delivering the computer's warning in a flat, robotic voice. For the next 20 minutes, she was not a tired, single mother haunted by her own mother's disapproval. She was a narrator, a voice actor, a co-pilot on a grand adventure. She was entirely present, entirely his. When she finally kissed his forehead and tucked Barnaby in beside him, his breathing was already deep and even, his face peaceful in the soft glow of his rocket ship nightlight. Her own work, however, was not done. After washing the dinner dishes, Sophie brewed a cup of tea and sat down at the kitchen table. From a hidden spot in the hall closet, she retrieved her secret. It was a large, leather-bound sketchbook, heavy and filled with thick, creamy paper. She opened it carefully. Inside was the answer to Agnes. For months, Sophie had been pouring every spare moment of her energy, every ounce of her creativity, into this book. It was a story. Their story. On the pages, rendered in detailed ink drawings and vibrant watercolor, was the epic of Captain Danny and Commander Barnaby. She wasn't just writing a story, she was illustrating their shared imaginary worlds. There were detailed schematics of the Stardust, maps of fictional planets they had invented together, and colorful portraits of the alien species they had encountered on their narrated adventures. She was the author, the illustrator, the bookbinder. Every word was in her handwriting, every line drawn by her hand. Tonight, she was working on the swirly-whirly galaxy. With a fine-tipped pen, She began to draw a massive, swirling spiral nebula, leaving a space in the center for the watercolor she would apply once the ink was dry. She worked with intense focus, the rest of the world falling away. This was more than a gift. It was a legacy. It was proof. A physical, tangible manifestation of a love that was measured not in dollars, but in hours, in effort, in the quiet, dedicated weaving of a shared world. She paused, her hand hovering over the page. A wave of exhaustion washed over her. Through the kitchen doorway, she could see a small pile of bills on the counter, a stark reminder of the realities her mother was so quick to point out. A whisper of doubt, cold and sharp, slithered into her thoughts. "It's just paper and ink, Sophie. You'll look at it for a week, and then it will sit on a shelf. A new bicycle would last for years." She closed her eyes, forcing the voice away. She had to believe this was enough. She had to believe that when Daniel looked at this book, he wouldn't see paper and ink. He would see their adventures. He would see their love. He would see her. The weeks leading up to Daniel's 7th birthday were a frantic, whispered race against time. Sophie worked with a quiet, feverish intensity, the kitchen table becoming her nightly sanctuary. The book grew thicker, heavier, a tangible repository of late hours and loving effort. She filled the pages with their entire mythology: the grumpy, crystal-skinned aliens of Crystalline 5, the mischievous shadow cats of Nocturna, and the grand, soaring space whales of the celestial deep. Each illustration was a memory, each sentence a shared secret. The circles under her eyes grew darker, and her reliance on cheap, strong tea became absolute, but the project fueled her with a sense of purpose that defied her exhaustion. Agnes called 2 days before the small party Sophie had planned. Her voice was bright, casual, the voice she used when she was about to bestow a grand, unassailable favor. "Sophie, darling, I won't be able to make it to his little get-together on Saturday. I have a charity luncheon," she began, the apology thin and perfunctory. "But don't you worry. His real present will make up for it. I've booked it. A 4-day trip to Galactic Kingdom for his spring break. Flights, hotel, express passes for all the rides. The works. Galactic Kingdom. The country's biggest and newest theme park, a universe of animatronic aliens, simulated space voyages, and zero-gravity roller coasters advertised relentlessly on every children's television channel. It was a child's dream, a place so far beyond Sophie's financial reach it might as well have been on another planet. The phone call left Sophie feeling hollowed out. She looked at the book sitting on her table, its leather cover now stitched and bound, the pages filled. It felt small. It felt quaint. It felt like paper and ink. Her mother, with a single phone call, had offered Daniel a galaxy. She was offering him a story. The old, familiar doubt came rushing back, a cold, sickening tide. Was she being selfish? Was she forcing him to accept her humble, handmade world when a universe of professionally engineered fun was waiting for him? That night, she didn't sleep. Fueled by a fresh wave of defiant determination, she put the final touches on the book. She painted the last shimmering star in the swirly-whirly galaxy, carefully lettered the title, The Adventures of Captain Danny and Commander Barnaby, in gold ink on the cover. And on the very first page, she wrote a simple dedication. "To my greatest adventurer. Thank you for letting me be part of your crew. Love, Mommy." The morning of his birthday dawned bright and clear. Sophie had taped a few balloons to the chairs and placed a single homemade cupcake with a lit candle on the table. It was a stark contrast to the lavish catered parties her mother had thrown for her as a child. Daniel came running into the room, his eyes wide with the pure, unadulterated joy that only a 7-year-old on his birthday can possess. "Happy birthday, my sweet boy," Sophie said, hugging him tightly. After the cupcake was devoured and the candle blown out, Sophie retrieved the gift. It was wrapped simply in brown paper and tied with twine. Daniel tore it open, his brow furrowed in curiosity at the heavy, unmarked book. He opened the cover. He saw the dedication first, and his small fingers traced her handwriting. Then he turned the page. A gasp. It was a detailed cross-section drawing of the Stardust, exactly as they'd always described it, from the biscuit-fueled engine room to the cockpit designed for a boy and his one-eyed teddy bear. You made this?" he whispered, his eyes wide with awe. He turned another page and then another, faster and faster. "Mommy, look! It's the meteor monsters. And here's the ship. That's the swirly-whirly galaxy we were reading about. It's all here!" He wasn't just looking at pictures. He was looking at their world. He carefully turned each page, his face a kaleidoscope of shock, recognition, and profound joy. He gently touched the paintings, as if he could feel the texture of the stardust she had rendered in watercolor. He didn't see paper and ink. He saw the truth. He saw their love, made real and solid in his hands. He scrambled onto her lap, the heavy book held tightly to his chest, and buried his face in her neck. "It's the best present ever," he mumbled into her shoulder. "It's our whole life." Sophie held him, tears finally blurring her vision. Not tears of anger or humiliation, but of overwhelming, bone-deep relief. The phone rang. It was Agnes, calling to wish her grandson a happy birthday. Sophie put it on speaker. "Happy birthday, Daniel, darling," Agnes's voice chimed. "Did your mother tell you my surprise? You're going to Galactic Kingdom." "Wow, thank you, Grandma. That's so cool," Daniel said, and Sophie's heart gave a slight pang. But then he continued, his voice breathless with an even greater excitement. "But Grandma, you won't believe what Mommy made me. She made a book of all my adventures with Barnaby. It's our real book. It has the stardust and all the planets, and she painted everything. It's the best present in the whole entire universe." Sophie looked down at the top of her son's head, nestled against her chest, and listened to the stunned silence on the other end of the line. For a long moment, Agnes said nothing. When she finally spoke, her voice was strained, thin. "Well, that's lovely, dear." It was enough. It was more than enough. As Daniel chattered on, describing the shadow cats of Nocturna to his grandmother, Sophie hugged him and his book. She had her proof. Love wasn't measured in dollars or destinations. It was measured in time, in stories, in the quiet, steadfast act of showing a little boy that his world, no matter how imaginary, was real and important enough to be bound in leather and gold. The days leading up to Daniel's birthday passed in a blur of focused intensity. The book, now nearly complete, lay hidden in its spot in the closet, a secret treasure. Sophie had finished the last illustration, a triumphant portrait of Captain Danny and Commander Barnaby standing on the newly discovered planet of Lumina, a world lit by gentle, floating jellyfish-like creatures. She had carefully bound the pages herself, stitching the spine with thick waxed thread. Holding it in her hands, she felt a surge of pride that was fierce and protective. The book was heavy, substantial. It felt like a testament. The day before the party, disaster struck. The old, sputtering sedan she relied on to get to her part-time job and to ferry Daniel to school finally gave up. It died with a shudder and a cough in the parking lot of the grocery store, refusing to start again. The tow truck driver gave a low whistle as he hooked it up. "Gonna be an expensive one, ma'am," he'd said with a sympathetic grimace. He was right. The mechanic called an hour later with the verdict. A new transmission was needed. The cost he quoted was a breathtaking, impossible number that made the air leave Sophie's lungs. It was more than her rent. It was an amount she simply did not have. For the first time, she seriously considered calling Agnes. The thought was a bitter pill. She pictured her mother's voice, the cool, "I told you so." That would be lurking beneath a veneer of concern. Agnes would pay for it, of course. She would wire the money in an instant, and the problem would vanish. But it wouldn't be a gift. It would be a transaction. It would be leverage, a debt Sophie would be expected to repay with deference and gratitude, proof that her independence was a flimsy facade. She paced the small apartment, the phone feeling like a 10-pound weight in her hand. The pile of bills on the counter seemed to mock her. The doubt she'd fought so hard to suppress came roaring back, a tidal wave of insecurity. What was she doing? Was her pride more important than having a reliable car? More important than her own peace of mind? Her gaze fell on Daniel, who was sitting on the floor, happily drawing. He was using the cheap, waxy crayons she could afford, but his imagination was boundless. He was drawing a picture of them, standing beside a spaceship that looked suspiciously like her beat-up sedan. In the picture, they were both smiling, holding hands. "What are you drawing, sweetie?" she asked, her voice tight. "It's us," he said without looking up, concentrating on giving her bright blue hair. "We're going on an adventure. You, me, and Barnaby. We don't need the stardust today. We can just use the car. It can fly too." Sophie's throat closed. He saw their car not as a rattling metal box on the verge of collapse, but as another potential vessel for their adventures. He saw magic and possibility where she saw only failure and financial stress. In his world, their love and their stories were the fuel. Everything else was just a prop. The decision solidified in her heart, hard and clear. She would not call Agnes. She went to her bedroom and opened the small jewelry box on her dresser. It contained only a few modest pieces, but at the very bottom, wrapped in a piece of faded velvet, was a gold locket. It had been her father's, and his father's before him. It was simple, unadorned, and the only tangible thing she had left of him. She remembered him showing her how to open the tiny clasp, his large, gentle hands against her small ones. Her fingers trembled as she picked it up. Selling it felt like a betrayal, like severing a final, fragile link to her past. But then she thought of the book in the closet. She was creating a new legacy, one built not on inherited gold, but on shared moments and boundless love. She was trading a memory from her childhood to preserve the magic of her sons. The next morning, after a bus ride to a reputable jeweler in a neighboring town, the locket was gone. The cash in her hand felt both obscene and freeing. It was enough to cover the car repairs, with a little left over for the simple birthday party she had planned. As she rode the bus back home, the city sliding past the window, Sophie didn't feel sadness. She felt a quiet, steely resolve. The choice had been a painful one, but it had been hers. She had protected their small, perfect world on her own terms. Now there was only the party left. Only the moment when she would finally place her own legacy, bound in leather and filled with love, into her son's hands. The day of the party was bright and clear. The small apartment, though sparsely decorated with a string of colorful, hand-cut paper flags and a bunch of balloons, felt full to bursting with warmth. Daniel, wearing a paper crown Sophie had made, vibrated with an almost electric excitement. The car was back, running smoothly, and the scent of a freshly baked chocolate cake hung in the air. A few of Daniel's friends from school ran through the living room, their happy shrieks echoing off the walls. Sophie watched them, a genuine smile gracing her lips for the first time in days. The weight of the past week, the anxiety over the car, the painful decision to sell the locket, it all seemed to recede, replaced by the simple, profound joy of her son's happiness. After the cake was eaten and the games were played, a lull settled over the small gathering. This was the moment. Sophie's heart began to beat a little faster. She retrieved the book from its hiding place. It was wrapped in plain brown paper, tied with a simple string. "I have one more present for you, sweetheart," she said, her voice soft. Daniel, his face still smeared with chocolate frosting, looked up at her, his eyes wide with anticipation. He took the heavy rectangular package and carefully tore away the paper. He gasped. There, in his hands, was the adventures of Captain Danny and Commander Barnaby. His own name was on the cover, in elegant, hand-painted letters, right below a stunning illustration of him and Barnaby staring out from the cockpit of a spaceship. He ran a small hand over the cover as if he couldn't believe it was real. He opened the book, and a reverent silence fell over him. He turned the pages slowly, his eyes tracing the words he knew so well, now immortalized in print. He saw the vibrant, detailed illustrations of their imaginary worlds, the crystal caves of Xylos, the swirling gas giants of the nebula's heart, and finally, the gentle, jellyfish-like creatures of Lumina. He saw himself, brave and heroic. He saw his mother's love made tangible page after page. He looked up at her, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "You made this?" he whispered, his voice filled with awe. "For me?" "I wrote it all down," Sophie said, her own voice thick with emotion. "So we'll never forget." He didn't need to say thank you. The look on his face was more than enough. He hugged the book to his chest as if it were the most precious treasure in the universe. In that moment, Sophie knew that every sacrifice had been worth it. The locket was a memory of the past, but this book was the foundation of their future. It was then that a sharp, authoritative knock echoed from the door. Sophie's stomach tightened. She knew who it was before she even opened it. Agnes stood in the doorway, impeccably dressed, a large, professionally wrapped gift in her hands. Her expression was a mixture of disapproval at the noise and a grudging sense of obligation. "Sophie," she said, her voice cool, "I hope I'm not interrupting." "Mom," Sophie said, her voice steady. "Come in." Agnes stepped inside, her eyes sweeping over the humble apartment, taking in the homemade decorations and the remnants of the simple party. The professionally wrapped gift suddenly looked ostentatious, out of place. Daniel, still clutching his book, looked at his grandmother. "Grandma, look what Mommy made me." He scrambled over and held the book up for her to see. Agnes, who had been about to offer Daniel her own expensive gift, was taken aback. She looked down at the hand-bound book, at the intricate illustration on the cover. She took it from him, her manicured fingers surprisingly gentle on the pages. She flipped through it. She saw the familiar stories, the ones Sophie had told her about over the phone, the ones she had dismissed as fanciful distractions. But here they were, brought to life with such vivid detail, Such undeniable talent and love. She saw the hours of work, the dedication, the sheer force of a mother's devotion poured onto every page. It was not a flimsy, childish fantasy. It was a work of art. It was a legacy. She looked from the book to her daughter, and for the first time, Sophie didn't see judgment in her mother's eyes. She saw a flicker of something else. Respect. Maybe even a hint of shame. Agnes looked at the expensive, store-bought toy in her hands and then back at the book. There was no comparison. One was a transaction. The other was a testament. "It's beautiful, Sophie," Agnes said, her voice softer than Sophie had heard it in years. "It's the most beautiful gift I've ever seen." She handed the book back to Daniel, who beamed. Then Agnes looked at her daughter, truly looked at her, and a small, genuine smile touched her lips. "Your father would have been so proud," she said. And with those words, the years of misunderstanding and resentment seemed to melt away. It wasn't a perfect ending, not a sudden, magical fix. But it was a beginning. It was a bridge built across a long, silent chasm, constructed not from money or obligation, but from the shared love for a little boy and the incredible story his mother had created for him. Sophie smiled back, a real, relieved smile. She had chosen her own way, forged her own legacy, and in doing so, had found not only her own strength, but a way back to her mother as well. As she watched Daniel show his friends his new favorite book, she knew their adventures were just beginning.